Hundreds of ships have sunk here. Most famous, the Edmund Fitzgerald, the Titanic of the Great Lakes, a freighter deemed invincible.
At more than 700 feet long, the SS Edmund Fitzgerald was a massive steel vessel believed to be unsinkable. But 46 years ago, on a stormy November night, it was swallowed by Lake Superior, triggering a 50-year debate over what caused the disaster.
Look at that, it's just totally,
Completely shredded.
mangled, yeah.
Yeah.
It's like no man's land. I didn't realize just how severe the damage was in between the two sections.
That long debate has finally reached an answer. Researchers deployed an unmanned underwater vehicle equipped with a 4K camera and an AI scanning system to conduct the most detailed survey ever made of the wreck. The data it captured is not only astonishing, but also reveals the deadly weaknesses that sealed the ship's fate. Mighty Fitz, the engineering symbol of the Great Lakes. The SS Edmund Fitzgerald was once regarded as a benchmark of cargo ship engineering on the Great Lakes. When it was launched in 1958, regional newspapers called it the Mighty Fitz, a vessel so large, fast, and reliable that many captains considered it the standard of its entire generation. The Fitzgerald was nearly 730 feet long, roughly the length of 2 football fields placed end to end, and it could carry more than 26,000 tons of taconite iron ore on a single trip. For the American steel industry from the 1950s through the 1970s, its steady flow of shipments was essential. The ship moved raw materials from Minnesota to Michigan almost nonstop for 17 years. What made the Fitzgerald stand out was not just its size, it was the consistency of its performance. Operational records show that the ship often completed voyages ahead of schedule, even in unstable weather. Crew members from other freighters recalled that they could recognize the Fitzgerald from miles away simply by its speed and the deep tone of its horn, a sound many considered one of the signatures of the lake. Behind the ship's record was Captain Ernest McSorley, a man with more than 40 years of experience on the Great Lakes. Captains who sailed at the same time described him as calm, reserved, and famously disciplined, someone who understood Lake Superior better than most who had ever crossed it. Among the 29 crew members on board, many had served on the Fitzgerald for decades and considered it the most dependable ship they had ever worked on. But every professional mariner on the Great Lakes acknowledged one truth. Lake Superior is not simply a lake. In scale and weather behavior, it functions more like an inland sea. Each November, the region produces storms with winds reaching hurricane force and waves as tall as a 3-story building. Meteorologists in the region have long used a familiar nickname for this period, the November Witch, referring to storms that form rapidly, shift direction without warning, and generate extreme waves in only a few hours. Even so, for nearly 2 decades, the Edmund Fitzgerald passed through storm season after storm season without serious incident. Shipping agencies and veteran captains alike viewed it as a freshwater titan, large, sturdy, and seemingly immune to the harshest conditions on Lake Superior. That is why, when the Fitzgerald vanished in only a few minutes in November 1975, without sending a distress signal and without a single survivor, the entire maritime community around the Great Lakes was stunned. The final voyage, a 36-hour slide into disaster. On November 9, 1975, the Edmund Fitzgerald left the port of Superior, Wisconsin, beginning what appeared to be another routine trip. The ship was loaded with more than 26,000 tons of taconite pellets and headed for Detroit, following a route it had completed hundreds of times before. Traveling behind it was the freighter Arthur M. Anderson, a common practice during storm season, so that captains could support each other when conditions worsened. Weather conditions at the start seemed unremarkable. Meteorological agencies had issued storm advisories, but in November this was nothing unusual. For many years, the Fitzgerald had sailed through rough periods without major difficulty. With Captain McSorley's experience and the ship's strong reputation, there was no reason to believe this voyage would be any different. But by midday on November 10th, everything had changed. The weather system, which had begun as an ordinary low-pressure area, strengthened rapidly as it moved toward the Great Lakes. Falling pressure forced the winds to shift suddenly and rise far beyond earlier forecasts. Observation stations recorded gusts over 80 miles an hour near the storm's center, along with waves reaching 10 meters in height, well beyond what most freighters on the lake were comfortably built to withstand. By late afternoon, Fitzgerald began to show signs of trouble. At about 3:30, Captain McSorley radioed Anderson to report that his ship had developed a severe list, several ventilators on deck had been torn away, and part of the railing had been damaged. He also explained that Fitzgerald's radar had failed, forcing him to rely on the Anderson behind him for position updates in near-zero visibility. Despite this, his voice remained steady. He confirmed that the pumps were still working and said the ship was holding its own. Though the degree of listing suggested the waves were striking harder than usual, it was the first clear indication that the storm was exerting far more pressure on the Fitzgerald than the ship had faced in previous years. At 7:10 that evening, Anderson asked for an update. McSorley responded with the last words ever heard from Fitzgerald. "We are holding our own." There was no sign that the situation had spiraled beyond control. Nothing suggested that the ship was moments away from catastrophe. But only minutes later, the radar signal marking the position of the Edmund Fitzgerald vanished completely. A ship nearly 730 feet long and weighing tens of thousands of tons had disappeared without sending a single distress call, something almost unimaginable for a vessel of its size. When search teams reached the area where the ship was last recorded, all they found were several damaged lifeboats drifting in chaotic water. Not one had been properly launched, a sign that the crew had no time to respond. The speed of the disappearance became the center of debate for years. A large ship with a long history of surviving harsh conditions had vanished within minutes, a scenario that no captain or maritime engineer at the time could fully explain. A voyage that should have been ordinary had turned into a disaster no one could have predicted. And this moment marked the beginning of a 50-year effort to uncover what truly happened to a ship many believed could not sink. The 50-year investigation. The wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald was located only a few days after the disaster. It rested at a depth of about 160 meters in a dark, frigid environment where almost nothing survives. The first images, taken by early submersibles in the 1970s, shocked investigators. The ship had broken cleanly into two massive sections that lay about 50 meters apart, and the central portion of the hull was almost completely destroyed. This detail immediately triggered debate. It is not unprecedented for a large vessel to break apart, but the way the Fitzgerald split apart sharply, rapidly, and without any warning made many experts uneasy with the idea of a simple explanation. The first official report by the United States Coast Guard claimed that water had entered the cargo holds through hatch covers that had not been properly secured. According to that conclusion, the bow sank gradually, creating the forces that snapped the ship in two. But this view was strongly rejected by veteran sailors and by families of the 29 men on board, because if the ship had truly gone down slowly, the crew would have had enough time to send a distress call. It was clear that this had not happened. In the years that followed, engineers and researchers examined every detail of the sinking. They studied the ship's steel structure, weather conditions, the behavior of taconite pellets, and the final radio messages. One unusual pattern began to stand out. The type of steel used in the 1950s to build the Fitzgerald was known to become brittle in cold temperatures. This was not a problem under normal conditions, but during a storm with violent winds, heavy waves, and freezing air, brittle steel could lose its ability to flex under pressure. Independent tests in the late 1970s showed that the impact resistance of this steel could drop significantly in conditions similar to that night. Another important factor emerged. The Fitzgerald was over 700 feet long, a length that made it highly vulnerable to the forces created when waves lifted the bow while pushing down the center, or the reverse. Several ships built with similar materials during that era had fractured under extreme conditions without hitting reefs or obstacles. Investigators also reconsidered the ship's route late that afternoon. Based on radar data from the Anderson, some maritime specialists suggested that the Fitzgerald may have passed close to a shallow ridge after the storm caused winds to shift suddenly. In near-zero visibility, a light grounding was entirely possible. Such a strike would not have sunk the ship immediately, but a small fracture along the bottom could have weakened the hull, while the storm continued to apply powerful bending forces. The most frustrating problem for investigators was that none of the clues fully ruled out the others. Each possibility looked like a small piece of a larger picture, but none of them alone could explain everything. The deeper the investigation went, the more it seemed that the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald was not the result of one mistake. Instead, it resembled a chain of events that collided at the worst possible time, place, and conditions. A critical breaking point that the maritime industry of the era was not prepared to confront. Yet the investigation remained incomplete until modern underwater technology finally allowed researchers to return to the site with far greater clarity. Only then did the dark sediment of the lake begin to reveal the truth hidden for nearly 50 years. The breakthrough that changed everything. Nearly half a century after the Edmund Fitzgerald vanished, underwater technology had advanced enough to revisit the site with a level of detail that investigators in 1975 could not imagine. Early submersibles produced blurry, grainy images with uneven lighting that missed crucial features. Modern, remotely operated vehicles, equipped with 4K cameras, low-light sensors, and powerful lighting systems, completely transformed the investigation. As the drone descended more than 160 meters, the research team on the surface watched in near silence. The video feed gradually revealed sections of the hull that had been hidden in darkness for decades. The lights swept across the steel, and for the first time, analysts could study every fracture, joint, and surface where the metal had failed. The drone's first destination was the area containing the 21 cargo hatch covers. For 50 years, debate had focused on whether these hatches had failed during the storm. Close-up footage immediately revealed something critical. Many of the steel clamps were no longer in place. Some were missing entirely. Others were bent backward in a way that suggested they had not come loose over time, but had been torn apart by a sudden force. More importantly, the steel surfaces where the clamps had ripped away appeared smooth, sharp, and uniform. This kind of deformation is typical when materials are pushed beyond their design limits in a very short period. In other words, the pressure from the storm's waves had been strong enough to tear apart parts of the ship designed to be its first line of defense. As the drone continued toward the bow, a new detail emerged. A circular opening, roughly 4 inches wide, marked the spot where a ventilation pipe had once been attached, but the pipe itself was gone. The metal around the opening had been pulled apart in a pattern that suggested a sudden, violent force. Engineers later ran simulations showing that when such a vent is destroyed during 10-meter waves, water can rush into the cargo hold at a rate of thousands of gallons per minute, combined with the tons of taconite inside, which can absorb water during the first stages of flooding. It became entirely possible for the ship to take on water without any of the crew realizing it. This helped explain the calmness of Captain McSorley's final message. From the pilot house on the upper deck, he could see only the list and the heavy waves, but he had no way to observe the rapid flooding happening below. From his perspective, Fitzgerald appeared to be holding on. In reality, the bow was becoming heavier by the minute, a silent process hidden beneath the deck. The drone footage also resolved one of the most debated questions. Fitzgerald's steel had not failed from an internal explosion, but from repeated external pressure that pushed the metal past its limits at a moment when the cold had already made it brittle. The hull did not tear apart randomly. It fractured in a pattern consistent with a ship forced into extreme wave cycles at the exact moment when its materials were most vulnerable. All of this evidence forced experts to reconsider nearly every earlier assumption. For the first time, investigators had visual proof that wave pressure, aging steel, and flooding through damaged areas combined to create a scenario that almost no captain of that era could have anticipated. And from this clearer view of the wreck, the investigation finally approached the most important question of all. What happened in those final minutes when the ship's structure reached its breaking point and a freshwater titan collapsed in an instant? The silent breach and the water that crept in unseen. As the drone continued examining the bow section, the research team noticed something particularly alarming. The circular opening where a ventilation pipe had once been installed had been torn open completely. This was not the kind of damage caused by corrosion or a minor impact. The steel around the opening was bent outward, a sign of sudden force, the kind of force produced when powerful waves strike the deck and create pressure far beyond what the ship was originally built to withstand. The ventilation pipe had a simple purpose. It allowed air to escape as the cargo hold was filled with ore. But when that pipe was destroyed during the storm, it became a direct-down opening into the cargo hold, and that was the core problem. Under waves approaching 10 meters in height, water rushing through such an opening could reach thousands of gallons per minute. When engineers ran simulations, they found that water could flood the cargo hold so quickly that the crew would not detect it in time. Everything was happening deep below the deck, far from Captain McSorley's view. With each passing wave, the bow grew slightly heavier, lowering the front of the ship without any obvious indicator on the surface. The situation was made even worse by the type of cargo the Fitzgerald was carrying. Taconite pellets are extremely dense, but during the first few minutes of flooding, they behave like porous stone. They absorb water. Instead of creating a visible rising waterline, the initial floodwater would be held within the ore. This prevented the crew from spotting anything unusual through the ship's water detection systems or manual inspections. In other words, the Fitzgerald did not sink immediately. It sank in the most dangerous way possible. It sank without anyone realizing it was sinking. From the pilot house, McSorley saw only the list and the heavy waves, both common during a severe storm. The pumps were running, and everything above deck seemed to be holding. But far below, the bow was gaining weight every minute. As the bow grew heavier, it plunged deeper into the troughs between waves, creating stronger and more violent impacts with each swell. This created a dangerous feedback loop. The heavier the bow became, the greater the force of the waves, and the greater the force, the more the structural weaknesses were pushed toward failure. Drone footage of the bow section showed steel plates bent in a direction consistent with that scenario. The bow had been pressed repeatedly from the front, as if forced downward each time a new wave arrived. This also explained why no distress signal was ever sent. Investigators concluded that if the ship had flooded slowly, the crew would have had time to call for help. But the drone revealed a different reality. The bow had lost buoyancy far more severely than early estimates suggested. Under those conditions, a single powerful wave or the wrong combination of swells could have pulled the ship below the surface within seconds. And that is exactly what happened. Evidence from the lakebed showed unmistakable signs of a fatal breach. The destroyed ventilation pipe, the missing hatch clamps, and the steel torn outward all pointed to a level of pressure that exceeded the ship's structural limits. It was the strongest confirmation yet that the Fitzgerald lost buoyancy not because of a single mistake, but because several critical stresses occurred at the same time, beginning the moment water started pouring in silently. The moment of breaking and the legacy of a maritime tragedy. Once the water inside the cargo hold passed a critical threshold, the Edmund Fitzgerald could no longer maintain the balance that had been its defining strength through 17 years of service. Each incoming wave added weight to the bow, driving it deeper into the troughs. Behind it, the stern was lifted in the opposite direction. The difference in height between the two ends of the ship could reach several meters in a single gust of wind, an extremely dangerous condition for a vessel more than 700 feet long. In near-freezing temperatures, the steel became more brittle than usual. This made the midsection more vulnerable to bending forces. Drone footage showed that the central hull had deformed in the exact pattern expected when metal is subjected to repeated compression and tension in powerful wave cycles. All it took was for the bow to drop slightly deeper into one trough, while a wave lifted the stern high above it. The bending force at the midsection would reach a point the ship could no longer withstand. When the drone captured a close view of the bow resting upright on the lake bottom, researchers noted that it was embedded deep into thick sediment, proof that it had descended with considerable speed. The stern lay upside down about 50 meters away, with steel plating torn outward. This was the signature of a sudden break, not a slow sinking. The ship had split apart and vanished beneath the surface in less than a minute. These details finally explained why no distress call was ever sent. There was no time, no chance. Lifeboats recovered afterward still had their securing straps locked in place, meaning not a single crew member reached them. When experts combined all the evidence, a complete picture emerged. The destroyed ventilation vent, the torn hatch clamps, the brittle steel, the silent flooding, and the bending stresses created by the storm all pointed toward the same conclusion. The Fitzgerald did not fail because of one flaw. It failed because several dangerous conditions aligned at the exact moment the ship was most vulnerable. This is why the sinking became one of the most extensively studied maritime disasters in Great Lakes history. It forced authorities to reform safety regulations for freshwater freighters, improve steel inspection standards, redesign hatch covers, and strengthen weather alert systems. But more importantly, it served as a reminder to the entire maritime industry. No matter how large or modern a ship may be, every vessel has limits. A sudden shift in weather, one structural weakness, and a few minutes of misjudged conditions can combine into a breaking point that no one sees coming. Today, the Edmund Fitzgerald is more than an accident. It has become a symbol of a question that science and engineering continue to confront. In the harshest environments, is it possible that nature sometimes chooses a moment that human preparation can never match? A freshwater titan vanished in seconds, but its legacy continues to shape how ships are designed and operated to this day. And that may be the greatest legacy it leaves behind.